My name is Robin Nair, and I'm the chair of this session of webinar. This is, of course, a webinar series of seminars entitled Big Power Rivalry in the Pacific. Today's session is China and the Pacific, and this is the first in the series. I'm in Canberra. You're all elsewhere in the Pacific region and perhaps even further beyond. The great advance of technology brings us together. So it's wonderful. One of the very few positive outcomes of the scourge of COVID has been the greater recognition and the use of technology through Zoom conferencing. As the chair, I have the honor to welcome all of you participating today, the speaker, the commentators, and all the participants. I'd like to congratulate and honor the Fiji Institute of Applied Studies for initiating and hosting and facilitating these series of online seminars on international and regional issues, which are contemporary issues of direct interest to our region, the Pacific Islands Forum region. I'm very pleased that FIES has stepped in to fill this gaping hole in the lack of think tanks in the region. We are living in a world where we must be vigilant and educated about the world around us, particularly when we are such small island developing countries and often at the mercy of larger ones. What is around us matters directly to us. What is happening in our countries in relation to politics, the economy, our institutions, and human rights makes this broadening of our horizons even more important, so that we can stamp out any despotic tendencies from outside interference or indeed from our own governments. So I take this opportunity to pay particular tribute to Dr. Ganesh Chan and the director of FIES, Dr. Sunil Kumar, of this grand initiative. As I said, the subject of our seminar today is a very important one, China and the Pacific. It is more than the influence of China and the Pacific, but more so living with China and the Pacific Islands. And that's the topic today, living with China and the Pacific Islands. All our countries have witnessed and experienced the presence of China in our island countries. This has started an immense rivalry between, for example, the US, Australia, and New Zealand, with interest from other like-minded countries like Japan and India, and to a lesser extent, European Union and the UK. This is on the one hand, and the mighty China on the other, for influence in the Pacific Islands. We've seen lately new phrases being coined by some of our main aid donors to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, phrases directed to the region as if we are toys in their big boys games. Phrases like Pacific Setup, Pacific Pledge, Pacific Reset, Pacific Uplift, and Pacific Elevation, and others in this crowded field of stepping ups. This is in making sure that China does not dominate the region. To add to these fears are words like a march to autocracy. How do we digest all these sudden bombardments from the so-called West and China as well? And how can we be in a position to make up our own minds rather than being brainwashed with others' national interests? Only this week, Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the US, said during a visit to Vietnam that Asia won't have to choose between US and China. And I said, really? Is this really serious? We are, of course, asked to make choices by big powers, even if we don't want to. Today, we are very fortunate to have the great opportunity to hear from Dr. Fabrizio Bozzato, a senior research fellow in Oceans Policy Research Institute of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Japan, and a research fellow at the CEMAS Center of the University of Rome, La Sapienza. Dr. Fabrizio is a political analyst and commentator focused on East Asia and the Pacific Islands region. we will Dr. Fabrizio will give us his insight of how do the Pacific Islands fit into what he calls China's grand strategy. He'll speak for 30 minutes, followed by two listed discussions, who are Professor Shailendra Singh, an associate professor and coordinator of journalism from the University of the South Pacific. Many of you will know of him. Followed by, and we're very privileged to have the Honorable Matthew Kupa Wale, the leader of the opposition in the Solomon Islands and member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Solomon Islands Parliament. Each of them has 12 minutes or thereabouts to respond and to make their own comments or express their views. They can raise any question they wish to raise with Dr. Bozzato. After the last commentator spoke, and the session will be open for participation by our participants out there for short comments or questions. We have altogether 90 minutes for the session. It must finish by 4:30 p.m. Fiji time. If we have time, I will try to sum up. Otherwise, I'll send a record of this seminar through FIES. Thank you very much. And Dr. Bozzato, my pleasure indeed to give you the floor to take the floor as the lead speaker. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency Nair, thank you so much for your handsome introduction. It's an honor for me to be here today and have such distinguished commentators to my talk. I will, since I understand that time is of the essence, I will start my presentation right now. Being more familiar with meetings, I'll try to share my screen, and please tell me if you can see my slides. Can you?
Not yet.
I can hear you fine.
Yeah, but I prefer for you to see it.
I can see you.
Okay, then, but all right. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Oh, okay. I can't do. How do we? Anyway, go ahead, Dr. Bozzato. If others can see it, it's fine with me because I've seen your slides.
Okay, then I will do that. Very well. So.
Oh, I've lost your slides.
Sorry about that. Can you? Are they back now?
Nope.
Okay. Sorry about this.
That's much better. Yeah, I've got it.
Very well. So you confirm you can see them now?
Yes, very much.
Yes.
Wonderful. So a few words of introduction about myself. I'm originally from Italy, from the Veneto region, and I have three alma maters: the University of Milan, where I studied political science, the University of Tasmania in Australia, and Tankang University in Taiwan. I'll skip my affiliations because His Excellency Nair has already outlined them. And I also have the distinct honor of serving as Ambassador Extraordinary Plenipotentiary of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the Republic of Nauru. These are my alma maters. And as a scholar, sorry, and as a diplomat, I have a special relationship with the Pacific Islands region. From left to right, you can see me lecturing at the University of Fiji a few years ago. Then you can see the title and the cover of my doctoral dissertation that I successfully defended at Tankang University in Taipei, my diplomatic passport, the flags of the Order of Malta and Nauru flying together in 2019. And my latest publication, which is in a chapter in a book that has been published last week in Japanese, entitled Climate Security, Global Warming, and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. My chapter is on climate security in the Pacific Islands. Later this year, an electronic edition will be available in English. Well, I believe this is important. I do not represent as a diplomat the Republic of Malta, the beautiful island state in the Mediterranean, which is also a European Union member, but the Sovereign Order of Malta, which is officially the Sovereign Military Hospitality Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, which is a unique subject of international law, public law. So it's a sovereign entity, just like the Holy See. And presently, the order has diplomatic relations with 110 states, 4 in the Pacific Islands, plus the European Union, and as permanent observer status at the United Nations. The seat of government of the order since 1834 has been in Rome. Well, let's start with the political map of the Pacific. In the region, there are 14 Pacific Island states, plus a certain number of dependencies that are the legacies of the colonial era in the Pacific. Population-wise, almost 2/3 of the population of the region live in Papua New Guinea. The rest live in several small Pacific Island states and microstates. Signally, the region has the highest concentration of microstates. A microstate is a state with a population which is less than 500,000. The region is conventionally subdivided into 3 ethnogeographic subregions: Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. And in the region right now, there is what is called a renewed maritime awareness. In other words, the island states are now increasingly looking at themselves, describing themselves as large ocean states. Why? Because even though the land territory is small, they control huge maritime area. They have exclusive economic control of significant maritime resources, from fisheries to seabed minerals. This map, collectively, the exclusive economic zones of the Pacific Island states comprise an area which is equal to the territory of the Russian Federation. So the island states can also be described as the custodians of the Pacific. The Pacific is a geopolitically crowded ocean, where the range of external players and their different interests point to the complexity of the power plays. Borrowing the words of former Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum. The Pacific Island Forum is the main political organization in the region. Great power competition is back. And the Pacific Island states are seeing new partners and the traditional partners increasing the engagement and interests with the region. Well, history anyway doesn't repeat itself, or doesn't repeat itself exactly in the same way, since in the 19th and 20th century, great power competition in the region was for territory and presence. Now the context is, at least in my opinion, for influence and access. So the region is undergoing a paradigm shift that is happening at several levels and in several dimensions, from the diploscape, diplomatic scape, to the institution, regional narratives, and most notably, a new geopolitical paradigm is emerging in the region, where the Asian powers are functioning as vectors of change. In summation, the regional order is evolving rapidly. And the ASEANization process, borrowing an expression coined by Pacific Studies godfather Ron Crockham, the late Ron Crockham, has created new geopolitical opportunities, partnership options, and development alternatives for the Pacific Island countries, resulting in what it can be termed as a turn toward the north. And we know very well what's north of the region. There is Asia, and causing a mutation in their geopolitical DNA. New regional institutions are also facilitating fundamental power shifts in the region. This is widely acknowledged by the scholarly community, and also by political leaders. The slide shows the title of an event that was held in 2018 about the geopolitics of Micronesia. And the title is very, well, telling. Micronesian waters, no longer an American lake. Is it so? Well, that's debatable, but the fact that there's an open discussion about it is very significant. Also, the paradigm shift is played out in the geographical dimension. The region is shifting from the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. Paradigm, dimension, narrative. You can see a map of the Indo-Pacific region going from basically the Red Sea to the coast of Latin America, the Pacific coast of Latin America. In this sense, the Pacific Islands region is very much central in this new mega region, geographically, but also geopolitically. The Indo-Pacific conflates the West Pacific region and the Indian Ocean region into a new regional construct, and into a new single synergistic strategic system, which can be seen as a super region because of a increasingly tight economic, geopolitical, and security connection. And it's also a maritime super region with the ocean at the center and the land around. It's also a complex, multi-layer, multi-level system in which there are several levels, several sub-regions, some of them very distant from each other, but where any conflict involving major powers has a region-wide, mega region-wide impact. For instance, the territorial dispute in the South China Sea as being watched as a laboratory for how a powerful China behaves in the Southeast Asian seas, but also in other regional quadrants. And we should keep that in mind. The Indo-Pacific is also an heavily militarized region, where we have many military great powers and two military superpowers, and 5 nuclear capable nations playing the big and Indo-Pacific game. Also, the mental map of the Pacific Islands region in a bigger region has changed. Now, the world is bigger. And the shift from the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific narrative has real-world consequences, because the leaders perceive the regional strategic order and the challenges it faces in a different way than before. So welcome to the Indo-Pacific Brave New World. I offer you that collection of cartoons, not just to make fun of the political leaders of the region, but to point to the fact that the region is, first, very crowded, as I said before, but also, more importantly, that in such a situation, in such an environment, unilateralism can hardly work. In other words, the Indo-Pacific paradigm is also a multilateral, multipolar one. Of course, there are bigger fishes than others, but it's a very dynamic geopolitical ecosystem where the battle is also for the vigilant, the active, the brave, to quote from Patrick Henry. Now, let's narrow the focus back to the Pacific Islands region. What is the security, the regional security horizon, understanding, and agenda? Fortunately, we have a Rosetta Stone to understand it, which is the 2018 Boy Declaration, in which Pacific Island leaders reaffirm that climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. And they state that now the region has adopted an expanded concept of security, prioritizing environmental security, but also synergizing non-traditional security issues, human security, environmental security, in a new and peculiar way, which is a Pacific understanding. They are not adopting the narratives and the outlook of other of their traditional partners or other Indo-Pacific powers. So in other words, the security outlook is an indigenous and endogenous one. And also, this is a way to emphasize the fact that the Pacific Island states are determined to own their own security agenda. By contrast, what are the regional security concerns of the so-called traditional powers, aka the West? Well, you can see it. A big panda with a PRC, People's Republic of China flag, well, looming over the island states. So the realist West sees China's expansion as a destabilizing force, regionally and mega regionally, that should be contained, because China, like the Soviet Union, is trying to use hard power to push into the region and push out the traditional powers or the status quo powers like the US and its allies. In the regional equation, the China factor has become the transformative variable, because the expanded pervasiveness of Chinese interest in the region is driving plastic, which is irreversible, changes in its geopolitical ecosystem. How did China do it? Basically, through diplomatic dynamism, sending diplomats to the region, opening new diplomatic missions, inviting Pacific Island statesmen and political leaders to China, and with innate largesse, which is both strategic in nature and pragmatic in approach. As a result of the last decade, but I could say even the last 2 decades, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, has been developing resilient and highly adhesive ties with the Pacific Island nations. So if power, according to Mao Zedong, used to grow out of the barrel of the gun, Xi Jinping's China is aware that in the Pacific Islands, like in other regions, influence grows out of the generosity of the purse. The Chinese announce it to the region, or to the world, very clearly in 2006, when they dispatched the Premier Wen Jiabao, the then Premier Wen Jiabao, to a first multilateral summit between China and the Pacific Island countries. And Wen Jiabao said it clearly that China was in the region to stay, and the decision to engage with the region was strategic. So the question is, what is China really after in the Pacific Island region? Well, first of all, we should understand that China is an ancient country, an ancient nation, an ancient civilization, which has a very sophisticated grand strategy. It has 3 components: national security strategy, national development strategy, national unification strategy. And also as a country, as a nation, as a civilization with a dualistic strategic culture that has 2 strengths. One, which is more conflict averse and defensive minded, and the realpolitik one, which is more aggressive. But we should keep in mind that from the Chinese point of view, even offensive actions are seen as defensive. That's encapsulated in the concept of active defense. And that's a narrative that the Chinese repeat to themselves. It is very important to understand, to read their moves in the region and globally. Isn't it a contradiction? No. From the point of view of the Chinese mind, as Professor Lin Songping, who I had the honor of having as instructor at Tankang University, is a scholar well known both in Taiwan but also globally and in China. The Chinese always seek integrated duality. So they don't see contradiction in their behavior, while Western strategists, Western politicians, Western analysts immediately go to point to the contradiction and are baffled by the different approach that China has. Also, most importantly, China traditionally prefers to employ non-military means, non-military instruments, economic, diplomatic, psychological, cultural, media resources. Yet, military strength remains the backbone of this strategy, but the maxim of the People's Liberation Army is be fully prepared, but preferably no use. So force is the optional last resort. That's an element of difference with the Western big powers. In other words, China always prefers the indirect approach, or to be more precise, to combine the art of the direct and the art of the indirect approach. So how do the Pacific Islands fit in China's grand strategy? First of all, we should keep in mind that China's grand strategy or China's policies in the Pacific Islands region are part of a bigger picture. China is playing a game, a chess game on many tables. the Pacific Islands region is one of the regions in which China is applying its grand strategy to rise to prominence. So let's start with the national unification strategy, which is basically pursuing and achieving unification with Taiwan. 4 Pacific Island states do recognize the Republic of China, which is the official name of Taiwan. And there are 4 of the 15 out of 15 states that still have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So over the last 20 years, both sides have been consolidating relations with their diplomatic allies in the Pacific, even though in 2019, Beijing effected the diplomatic switch of Kiribati and the Solomon Islands. That was the situation in 2019 until September 2019. China was recognized by 8 out of 14 Pacific Island states, plus Australia and New Zealand, and Taiwan had the diplomatic allegiance of 6. That's the situation now. Taiwan is recognized by 4 states, China by 10. These are the states recognized in Taiwan: Marshall Islands, Nauru, Palau, Tuvalu. All the others recognize the People's Republic of China. Well, the Taiwan-China diplomatic rivalry in the Pacific has quite a long history. China succeeded with opening the first embassy in the region in 1975 in Fiji. A crucial factor was that Taiwan lost its permanent seat and the right of veto in the United Nations Security Council to the advantage of the People's Republic of China. From then on, Pacific Island states start switching to China, even though some of them, like a pendulum, switch back and forth several times. Anyway, Taiwan's economy was doing well in the 80s and 90s, so that helped to counterbalance China's geopolitical and diplomatic pull. And especially in the early 2000s, the first decade of this century, both sides were engaging in what is called dollar diplomacy or checkbook diplomacy. In other words, they were bidding for the diplomatic recognition of the islands by being very generous, let's say so. In 2006, there were anti-Chinese riots in the Solomon Islands and in Tonga, and there were a sign that China's expansion in the region wasn't without problems and resistance. Then we had, during the presidency, the 2 terms of presidential terms of Ma Ying-jeou from 2008 to 2016. There was a substantial diplomatic truce between the 2 sides, but rivalry resumed fiercely in 2016 with the accession to presidency of the Democratic Progressive Party and President Tsai Ing-wen. As I say, Kiribati and the Solomon Islands switched to China in 2019. Even though Taiwan is left with 4 diplomatic allies, it's quite unlikely that we'll lose them anytime soon, because all of them are firmly in Taiwan's side. Their political leaders certainly are. And also, in the case of Palau, both President Mengesau and President Whips invited the United States to establish a base in Palau. Then Taiwan intervened in what can be called the Undersea Cable Pacific War in 2018, and when Huawei was prevented for laying the cable, the fiber optic cable connecting Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. And also now in 2021, when Nauru, a diplomatic ally of Taiwan, was able to, well, exclude Huawei from posing the Micronesian cable. And the Taiwan, of course, put its geopolitical weight and diplomacy on the table. The national development strategy basically is China after the resources of the region. Yes, China, the trade volume has increased significantly, even albeit from a low base. China keeps investing massively in the region. And well, Chinese tourism was very important now, and probably will be a very important source of revenue for the United States in the future after the pandemic. Since 2013, China has reframed its regional economic approach under the One Belt, One Road initiative and include the Pacific Island region in the 21st century maritime Silk Road. In 2017, it also included the Pacific Island region in one of its ocean corridors that you can see in this map, in the so-called Blue Economic Passage, reaching to the Pacific. Other two go through the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, and the third one to Europe through the Arctic. But for many years, resources have been a secondary interest, and China's economic interests in the region were very limited. In fact, even though the trade between China and the Pacific Islands has increased notably, it's still a tiny fraction of China's total trade. China, however, has a demand for natural resources like fisheries, timber, gold, other minerals. And so it pays attention to the regional resources and is bent to develop them and extract them. But compared to other regions like Latin America or Africa, the Pacific Islands are relatively not resource rich on a large scale. The flagship project in the Pacific of China in the Pacific Islands is the Ramo nickel mine and the plant, which is run by a Chinese company. But that Chinese investment is not without problems because local communities are resisting the mine and the plant on the grounds of environmental damages that they cause. Then China is a villain when it comes to illegal logging in the Pacific. And also, China has a huge fishing fleet that it has sent also to the Pacific. And China is eyeing the mineral resources of the Pacific seabed. Well, China is one of the biggest distant water fishing nations, and it heavily subsidizes its huge fishing fleet. So several organizations or institutions like the European Parliament or the Global Initiative Against International Organized Crime say that China is one of the worst offenders when it comes to illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing in the Pacific. This is a reminder that China is also a destructive force. I'm very much aware of the damages that Western colonialism has inflicted to the region in the past, ranging from extractive practices in Nauru or Ocean Islands, or nuclear tests in the Pacific. But today we are talking about China. So I'm not characterizing China as the villain in the region. I'm saying that China is also a destructive force. And if it is part of the problem, it should also be part of the solution. As I say, the Pacific is currently the world laboratory of deep sea mining. Recently, Nauru notified the international development authorities that together with the Deep Green company, which is a Canadian company, is going to start mining in the deep sea in this exclusive economic zone in 2 years. In 2016, China adopted its first law on seafloor exploration, and Xi Jinping himself has stated that the deep sea is one of the new frontiers of China's global quest for resources. The Pacific Island Forum Secretariat also has a trade office in Beijing. It has been having it for quite a while, and that trade office represents all the members of the Pacific Island Forum, even those that give recognition to Taiwan. Third, national security strategy. The value of the region to China's national security strategy is debatable, even though there is a strong narrative pushed by politicians, scholars, the media, that China is challenging the West also in the Pacific Island region. It's certainly doing it in certain sectors of the Indo-Pacific and East Asia. But, well, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's doing that in the Pacific Islands. For a start, China does not have any military presence in the region. So all those alarm bells that are sound about the rank, about China's coming to the region with its military, well, are based on assumptions rather than on actual facts. So we should not exaggerate the military threat posed by China, supposedly posed by China in the Pacific Islands. Also because none of the island states lie close to the strategic sea lanes that service the bulk of China's trade in energy and raw materials. Besides, well, the Pacific Islands, or a part of it, Micronesia, are part of what is called the second island chain. You can see on the map the 3 island chains. The 3 island chains are actually a Chinese concept that was then adopted by Western analysts and scholars and Western militaries, postulating that China's mission is to project military power gradually beyond certain lines. And at the same time, it should be able to exclude other competitors from those regions. So at least part of Micronesia and Melanesia are within the second island chain, but in those quadrants, the US and its ally still retain a crushing military supremacy. And certainly, well, when it comes to the third island chain, we're talking just possibilities, eventualities. China has just got some aircraft carriers, but it doesn't mean they are adapt to use it in the wider Pacific. So is there a military power transition in process? No, I wouldn't say so. China is just strengthening its military. It is developing a deep water navy, but the balance of power is still very much in favor of the traditional Pacific powers.
Fabrizio, if you can finish it in a couple more minutes.
Yes, I will do it. Well, Chinese aid, we know that China gives, is the third aid provider in the region, even though it spends less than it has committed. And Australia is the first provider. China gives infrastructure, while Australia provides education, health, governance. I'll skip the numbers. China gives loans, while Australia gives grants. Grants do not create a potential debt trap. China provides infrastructures that can be termed not white elephants, but highly visible elephants, a constant reminder of China's generosity and economic prosperity. The Chinese, of course, will tell you that it's all out of South-South cooperation. The aid is mutually beneficial, as one wider claim in the region. Aid for China is perceived, because it's less conditional, perceived as more easy to assess by the island countries. And aid is also used to China to affect a collective identity. I will skip this. I will skip Australia's strategic anxiety and all the narrative about the Chinese are coming to the region, which is not substantiated by anything other than allegations from scholars and politicians. The vaccine diplomacy is played out in the region between China and the traditional partners. And word recommendation to the traditional powers: be wary of China's extra military challenges in Beijing's increasingly integrated grand strategy. You may be missing the key point. As the book of the 36 stratagems states, one guards on the west, but the enemy, if China is the enemy, is coming from the east. And well, pacifically put, using the words of the foreign minister of New Zealand, the Pacific has a challenge of its own. So it hasn't any obligation to align with one party, one side, or the other. But actually, it has the duty to seek its own way and partner with those partners that have the will to do it and can actually help. So the Pacific island states are very pragmatic, and I will finish. Whether aid comes from China or Australia or right across the world is consequential and irrelevant to them. In conclusion, China is likely to seek greater regional influence, including deeper and broader economic links, but appears unlikely to be the military threat to distant nations that geopolitical commentators fear. So the question is whether both Australia and China and the US and China need to be wary of each other in the Pacific Islands, or whether they might be able to cooperate. So thank you very much in the 3 languages that are official languages in Fiji. And I will also add 谢谢大家 in Chinese. The last slide is an homage to Folco Quilici, an Italian journalist and director that loved the Pacific and its people deeply. Thank you very much for your attention and passion. And I look forward to your questions, comments, and critiques.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bozzato. Very clear and very well organized presentation. Well, we could follow it very well indeed. And now I'd like to go straight to the commentators so that we can get our commentators to speak. and to critique on the on what you presented, or to give their own perspectives or from their own experience in their own work area of work. And there are a few questions I see that people have been sending, and we'll come to that after that. We'll go first to Professor Shailendra Singh, who is a well-known teacher of journalism, an associate professor in journalism, and he might have his own perspective from a media point of view about how China is reacting or behaving or investing in the Pacific. But it'll be an interesting one. Professor Shailendra.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Bozzato. I find your views really insightful and circumspect. You are very knowledgeable about the topic. It's a really crucial topic for the Pacific region, and I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you also, Fiji Institute of Applied Studies, for organizing this important discussion and inviting me to be part of it. We are reminded in today's talk that China has been in the Pacific for a very long time, and it will remain in the Pacific for a long time. This is the reality. It's very clear to us that China is now heavily invested in the Pacific. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's here to stay, make no bones about it, and we have to learn to live with this. So I think this should be very clear from the outset. The other thing I want to point out from the beginning is that we usually imagine China as a single entity, which is the Chinese state. We normally talk about what's happening on a very high level, at the geopolitical level. This is where most of the discussions are centered. But the fact is we are dealing with many facets of China in the Pacific region. So besides the Chinese state and besides geopolitical relations, we have social and economic impacts of the Chinese presence in the Pacific at the grassroots level. Within individual countries in the Pacific, we have Chinese private firms, for example, or firms in partnership with the Chinese state operating in the Pacific. We have farmers, large and small scale. We've got market vendors, cooks, laborers, and ordinary moms and dads, running that corner, that shop down the road. So all these are components of China in the Pacific. Whether they aid and abet, China in the Pacific is another topic, of course. This is an important distinction that was made by Professor Tarcisius Kambutaulaka from the University of Hawaii, and this is something we tend to overlook in a lot of the analysis. Okay. The other point I want to make very quickly is that not everything about China in the Pacific is negative or positive. But I suppose the same can be said about any country in the Pacific. Let's look at how the Chinese presence might have been beneficial for us. A lot of development in the Pacific region would not have been possible without Chinese money. Okay, so having said that, of course, we also have what you might call instances of overdevelopment, or what we might, some of these unnecessary projects in the region. A good example is the $28 million conference center in Vanuatu, which is a white elephant. Vanuatu doesn't have that much use for it, and it's too expensive to maintain. Recently, Samoa canceled a $100 million Chinese port development. The new prime minister said neither can they afford it, nor do they need it. So for us, the question is, why did the previous government enter into this deal in the first place? How come we have such different perspectives on this port development in Samoa? So the thing with China is, the Chinese interest in the Pacific region, they tend to deal directly with decision makers in high places. And what the critics have been saying now for some time is that due diligence is not a strong priority, unlike with maybe Western governments. So sometimes you are left wondering whether if some of the deals are cut in the national interest or in the personal interest. So these are some of the things we are dealing with in the grassroots level. Take the Vanuatu example again. What does Vanuatu need more? A hospital or a conference center? Okay, now some analysts believe there is no death trap in the Pacific. Maybe not yet, but you can never be sure about the future. What the Vanuatu and Samoa examples indicate is that the Pacific needs to be careful about infrastructure projects with China. I think we should be keeping a close watch on what's happening in other parts of the world and learn from it, both the good and the bad. It was also alarming to hear today that China is playing chess and the Pacific may be pawns in its grand strategy. The underlying theme, I think, from Dr. Bozzato's presentation was, again, we have to manage very carefully our relations, all our relations with China. After all, we are dealing with an economic, military, diplomatic, and technological superpower. So the onus really is on us to be well prepared. Otherwise, we only have ourselves to blame. We can't put the blame on China. We have to play our part too and be prepared in any kind of negotiations, whether it's China or any other country. As the keynote presentation reminds us, international relations and diplomacy is ever changing and incredibly complex. Right? It's an arena for the big boys, if you may. And we as a region have to be prepared to play on those terms, or we might turn out to be really big losers on the international stage. This is what I gather from the presentation. We need to keep reminding ourselves that in geopolitics, everyone is looking after number one, first and foremost. Whatever we might be hearing from these other countries, I think self-interest prevails. And this is something we should always remember. Generally speaking, the Pacific approach of friends to all, enemies to none seems to be a sound strategy to get the best of both worlds. But this is easier in theory than in practice. For example, when it comes to Taiwan, you are either with China or you are against China. China won't have it any other way. So we are forced to choose. This is another issue. Dr. Bozzato's presentation reminds us of the saber rattling. One of the alarming things about Dr. Bozzato's presentation was the recent saber rattling between China and the US. And it kind of makes us think how we might be affected. I think, make no mistake, the tensions are very real. So there should be some discussion in future on how we might be drawn into a military confrontation and the potential consequences for us as a region. Okay, some analysts believe that a war is unlikely, while others think it's inevitable. I agree with Dr. Bozzato that the military threat should not be exaggerated. But my question to him is, can it be ruled out completely? And if there's a confrontation, should we start thinking as to how we might be affected and maybe how we should start preparing for it? I don't know whether or not if that is something we should be doing, but that's the question out there for you. Will we get trampled like the proverbial ants in the war between elephants? Or will we escape? As Dr. Bozzato outlines, we are part of a heavily contested region. I feel we should start thinking and talking about these issues as we discussed our ties with China, the US, and other powers, vying for our attention. We are trying very hard not to merely become pawns for the bigger powers, and we need to hold our ground in any negotiations. For the region, maybe China is both a boon and a curse in the Pacific. For instance, is the Chinese presence. I believe it is the Chinese presence that has renewed interest in our region. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's a bit of both. One positive outcome is that it has actually strengthened our hand in some ways. Australia, New Zealand, the US, and Europe have increased development aid in the region considerably, and it's all part of a pushback against Chinese influence, whether they like to admit it or not. So today's presentation kind of makes me wonder, without China, will the Pacific matter as much in the world stage? Okay, lastly, I'm in the media field, and I'd like to add just a very few things on this topic, China's influence on Pacific media. Now, people have noticed some determined Chinese efforts in the Pacific media sector. The Pacific media is very much part of China's plans to make its presence felt. I mean, if you read some research reports, this is very clear. China is giving scholarships, entering into partnerships with local media, and also providing free news content. There's a good research paper on this from the Australian National University Department of Public Affairs, and the paper was written by Zheng and Watson. Not many people know this, but China's biggest news agency, Xinhua, even has a branch in Suva, Fiji, since 2010. So ideologically, the Pacific media were nurtured on the Anglo-American watchdog model. And this is based on a separation of powers. This is a very important element of the watchdog model. Now, if you look at the Chinese media model, it is based on cooperation with the state. It is heavily surveilled and censored as well. So Pacific media are financially vulnerable and small. And it will not take much for Chinese interests to capture some Pacific media outlets. They are so small, so vulnerable, financially weak. So this is a risky proposition because for all their faults, Pacific media receive a lot of criticism, but for all their faults, Pacific media are still a very important component of good governance in the region. So Chinese overtures in the media sector are a bit of a concern, but we need more research. Let me give another example very quickly. Chinese, if you look at China, it dominates resource extraction in the Pacific region, often in cahoots with state officials. And we need a strong local media to keep an eye on such activities. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to Pacific media, size doesn't matter. What matters more is the strategic value of the Pacific media, and China knows this. Okay, I think my time might be up, and that's all from me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Shailendra Singh. It's very interesting. You wrote it down from the geopolitics to the grassroots level, and your comments also on the media thing is noted and very interesting. Regarding Australia, we'll have another seminar. I think it's the third one in the series, and it'll be interesting to see or listen or hear about Australia's reaction to what China is doing in the region, or what Australia is trying to belatedly from push from China, trying to do or increasing its presence in the Pacific. But we're very fortunate to have Honorable Matthew Wale with us, the leader of the opposition from the Solomon Islands Parliament. It's good to have somebody from the political sphere, and especially from one of the island countries in Melanesia. Matthew Wale, welcome, and I give you the floor and look forward to hearing your views.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thank you to the presenter and the speaker before me. I feel such a misfit partly being the only politician in this discussion, but also, of course, of much less academic credence. I would just like to draw perhaps 4 points from the presentation. And firstly, climate change and sea level rise are without a doubt an existential threat and the #1 national security problem for many Pacific Island countries. Increasingly, Pacific Island countries view the US, China, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Japan, France, and others who have an interest in the Pacific through the prism of their policies and actions in climate policy domestically in their own jurisdictions and internationally. The climate denial by President Trump during his term, I think, did a lot of damage to the US's standing in this region. And the much more aggressive approach taken by President Biden, I think, is somewhat helping to rebuild some trust that the US is sincere in providing leadership on climate change. Of course, the Pacific Islands region would prefer that on the matter of emissions reduction targets that 1.5 degrees Celsius and below ought to be the target for high emitters. Just let me touch briefly on the Australian climate change policy. I'm sorry, Mr. Nair, or the lack of one, is a very serious gap in its specific step up and undermines its regional leadership role. I would go further and say that Australia has shown itself to be anti-Pacific Island countries in international fora that dealt with setting emissions targets by being very proactive in lobbying against the interests of Pacific Island countries when it comes to emissions targets. And it seems to me Australia is yet to realize or recognize the substantial damage its climate change policy recalcitrance is doing to its standing and influence with the Pacific Island countries. Long-term energy insecurity in the Pacific Island countries, increasing food insecurity, increasing natural disasters, population displacement due to sea level rise. All these conspire to undermine already weak governments and sovereignty and render the region vulnerable to outside powers. The PRC's commitments in Paris and its announced commitments since to net zero by 2060, I think, are endearing it to many Pacific Island countries, although doubts remain as to its sincerity. Clear leadership in ambitious domestic climate change policy and international coalition building to achieve high emissions reduction targets are important markers in creating capital and influence in the Pacific Islands region. Secondly, just let me come to political interference in Pacific Island countries. This, I would say, is a real fear. The blue Pacific that comprises large ocean states is now the ground for geopolitical and geostrategic competition. Pacific Island countries' disposition to this new reality has been so far mixed. On one end, a realization that the geostrategic competition increases the region's leverage with the powers, and on another, a dread of the consequences of being on the ground on which the two elephants fight. Pacific Island countries' foreign policy and relations have erred on the side of a cautious approach. Traditionally, US allies, Pacific Island countries are waking up to the reality of the PRC's might economically and militarily and want to tread carefully with it. However, we do welcome the increased attention and interest from the PRC, which has generated the interest from the US and its allies to the Pacific Islands region, without which I think we may still be a backwater. However, Pacific Island countries dread being tossed about by the competitors in pursuit of their own interests and pushing Pacific Island countries along with them. In the case of Solomon Islands, let me just make a few observations. The switch of diplomatic ties from Taiwan to China was mostly driven by a mercenary approach based on hopes by individual MPs in government, who now regret it, of course, that they were promised millions each when they make the decision back then. It is unclear if such promises have been fulfilled, but the promises were made. The switch was preceded by channeling of election funding, although clearly illegal, through one of the Chinese SOEs to select candidates and leaders. Also in the Solomons, the RCDF, the Constituency Development Funding, this is funded directly by members of parliament through them to their constituencies and represents a serious vulnerability to the country's sovereignty and governance, to say nothing of an independent foreign policy. Further, PRC funds the so-called National Development Fund, NDF, which is a slush fund to finance the Prime Minister's political interests. They only disperse on the signature of the Prime Minister, and it has been used in 19 and 2020, and now in 21, it's just come out this week. It's been used to distribute to MPs in the government to continue to give their support, political support to the Prime Minister. It may seem that the PRC perceives the current Prime Minister as their man, and so their support is targeted at maintaining his political support. This ought to be an egregious breach of national sovereignty and a serious corrosion of its governance and national interest. How, dare I ask, is a foreign policy going to be decided in matters that affect China and the US and its allies in the geostrategic competition? It's a very dangerous place to be. Just briefly on trade with China. Trade, of course, with China is an important marker in its relationship with the region. It builds significant influence. Traditional partners' trade with the Pacific Islands region has not shown significant growth over many years, and it is unlikely in the immediate future to see much growth. Trade with PRC has mostly been in fish and raw materials. Industry conduct and exploitative trade practices in these products have left many Pacific Island countries, especially in Melanesia, deprived of much needed revenue, degraded environments, and fueled corruption, especially amongst the. This has led to a lack of trust in the grassroots populations towards China. And then let me just finally touch on Australia in the Pacific Islands region. So there is a contrast. The Bowie Declaration, as alluded to by the presenter, made in 2018 at the leaders meeting of Pacific Islands Forum, remains the region's articulation of its security priorities. Australia is undoubtedly the leader in the Pacific Islands Forum and the Pacific Islands region economically, militarily, and through its aid program. Australia's sense of its own security vis-a-vis a rising China reverberates through the Pacific Islands region. China wolf warrior diplomacy towards Australia recently is also an important marker as Pacific Island countries look on. Pacific Island countries see economic coercion used by China on Australia and recognize their own extreme vulnerability. There is regional sympathy, I think, and empathy for Australia in that fight. Gray zone activities by China in the region, especially illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, will undermine China's position in the region. Pacific Island countries dread having to confront the PRC gray zone activity and will have to rely on Australia to do this. Australia's defense policy and posture ought to take into account this regional vulnerability and would be an opening to entrench its position as the security partner of choice. As set out in the Australian 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, Australia aims to, and I quote, to build a secure, prosperous, and inclusive Indo-Pacific of independent, sovereign, and resilient states. This, I would posit, was Australia's announcement that it is a geopolitical power. Australia must possess a credible military force capable
one
of
moment.
projecting. Sorry?
I said just could you conclude, Honourable Wale?
Yes.
Just
Yeah,
30 seconds.
Thank you. Capable of projecting power throughout its sphere of influence, and this credibility lies in its ability to act as a deterrence to other forces that may be engaged in hostile activity. So in conclusion, China is in the region to stay. We have to work with China. What China does in the South China Sea and what it does to its neighbors and what it does to Australia is instructive to how the Pacific Island countries see their own interests best protected and advanced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Wale, and I'm sorry for the time constraints, but we'll quickly go into the question phase so that we can address the questions, which is a very important part of the seminar. So I have, we've had 39, chats, which is very interesting. So there'll be people who've been following us, the seminar very closely. So it's good to know that there's been so much involvement and participation. So I'm just bringing up the question from Dr. Tarcisius Kamutaolaka. You all know he's from the University of Hawaii and of course the Solomon Islander. So he says Chinese companies, SOEs, private and joint ventures, provincial companies, etc., are usually at the forefront of Chinese diplomacy relationship with the Pacific Islands as elsewhere. Do Pacific Island governments have an extensive understanding of how Chinese companies operate, their relationship to the Chinese state and to other actors? Can the presenters comment Pacific Island governments' understanding of Chinese companies? Do Pacific Island governments have sufficient knowledge of how Chinese companies are organized and operate in the Pacific? I open the floor. Start with Professor Dr. Bozzato.
Very well. It's a question that is difficult to address because, of course, there are different Pacific Island governments. But if I will have to give a succinct reply, I will say that they are developing an understanding on how Chinese companies operate and to whom Chinese companies respond to and who owns them. The point is that we should differentiate between small, medium-sized companies and the big fishes that are, if not direct emanations of the Chinese government, they are tightly connected to it, and they have to follow their government's instruction and bidding, or else. So, and Chinese companies are one of the main instruments of the extra-military indirect approach the Chinese employ to gain presence and influence in the region.
Thank you very much. I might, has any of the other commentators got a, if you can quickly comment if you want to, Shailendra?
I think that's a question maybe best answered by Honorable Matthew Wale. With regards to the Solomon Islands, maybe.
Good.
Narcissus is from the Solomon Islands. Maybe that's where his question is directed at. I don't know.
Okay. Honorable Wale, quickly, if you can comment on that, and we'll move on to the next question. Thank you.
Yes, as to the case of Solomon Islands, I think I can pretty much say that there is very, very little rudimentary understanding of China's operations through its state-owned enterprises. When people hear of state-owned enterprises, they think, you know, Solomon Power, Solomon Water, or Solomon Ports, providers of public goods that are reasonably in this system of government, reasonably independent, run by professional boards and so forth. So there is a very rudimentary understanding of Chinese SOEs, and therefore their activities, I think, are not as clear or transparent.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, and quite a sensitive one, and quite an important one, very important indeed, whether the companies understand China or not.
Yes,
okay.
Sorry.
Yes.
Just very briefly.
Yeah.
We should also add an additional category to the ecosystem of the Chinese companies. There are state-owned companies, but there are also state-controlled companies. And that control doesn't mean that the state is a main shareholder, but this means that they have to act accordingly to precise inputs from the government and respond to it. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification. I'll go into the next question. It might be a bit of a political question, and if you can answer it quickly, because I've got one more question to go. It's from Kevin Mailanga, and it's a question to Honorable Matthew Wale. Since Solomon Island is the newly fall country to China, you have been vocal to the government of Solomon Islands. What will your stand be if you are taking the government, since Solomon Islands can be very vulnerable to any switches from opposition to government? Honorable Wale, would you want to comment on that?
Yes.
2 minutes.
Oh, wow. Yes. Well, I don't think that the switch to China or switch away from China is the issue, or was the issue, and it still is an issue. The Prime Minister lied to the country, Solomon Islands people, and said that prior to the decision being made, that he would consult widely, going down to all constituencies across the country. Of course, none of that happened. And that is the basis of Malaysia provincial government's position. And they have held out for more than a year now. So I think it is important to a healing. There is a rift in this country, Malaysia being almost a third of the population. It is important to the healing of this country that this question is put back to the people. Let them have their say.
Thank you very much. Very clear. And another question now here from Jake Sami from Fiji. Every country that colonized the Pacific exploited it for economic reasons and for its military strategic positions. Post-independence, most Pacific states were largely left to fend for themselves. China saw an opportunity and moved in with open purse when the West was asleep. How can the Pacific Island countries come to a strategic decision to turn China from being a problem to a solution? And that's assuming that China is a problem or otherwise. Dr. Bozzato, shall I start with you? Difficult question.
Yes, but also very stimulating question, because it allows me to restate some points I made in my presentation. First of all, how can you manage China in the Pacific and not allow it to become a negative force or another colonizer or exploiter? Well, first of all, the island states should become skilled rivalry managers. So develop a clear understanding of how the rivalry is played out between China and the West globally, in the Indo-Pacific and in the region, in the Pacific Islands region. Secondly, own the security agenda. Do not let outsider dictate the security agenda, the security outlook in the region. The Boy Declaration is a very good starting point for that. And thirdly, understand how China operates. It won't be, China will not send gunboats, will not send submarines, will not send aircraft carriers. They will send diplomats, companies, investors. They will build infrastructure that will need the Chinese to be managed. Once you understand the art of the indirect approach and understand that China prefers extra military, extra hard power means, then you can develop the antibodies to contrast the negative sides of China's presence in the Pacific. And also you can capitalize on the history of the region and on the colonial experience of the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bozzato. Thank you for a clear answer. There's a lot of comments over here, thanking all of you, Dr. Shailendra Bozzato, Dr. Bozzato, and of course, Honorable Wale. And there's a question here about Australia and New Zealand. I think that in the next, the third series of seminars would probably answer that question. And if Shaukat Ali could wait for that, and I hope we can attend that particular seminar. The last question, when I've got a minute to go, the recent Pacific Islands imbroglio, which drove the Micronesian five perhaps to a split, reveals the problem of the Pacific Islands. Is this a problem created by traditional powers or the Pacific Islands? How is China eyeing this? I'm just wondering. This is a question from Gonzaga Puas. Dr. Bozzato again, regarding the Micronesian splitting from the Pacific Islands Forum, 1 minute.
Okay, well, first of all, I say hello to my good friend Gonzaga. I think that the split can be, the responsibility for the split can be heavily attributed to the Micronesia states, but also to their partners. Micronesia is different from Melanesia and Polynesia in the sense that it is geographically closer to East Asia and to the so-called Western Pacific. It is essential to China containment. And we shouldn't forget that three Micronesia states are in compacts of free associations with the US, means the US is responsible for defense policies. And also that two Micronesian leaders, President Whips and Donald Panuelo, have invited the US to establish bases there. I would say that the very geostrategic peculiarity of Micronesia can be seen as one of the drivers of the split.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bozzato. I think we've come to an end. I'd just like to quickly thank each one of you. Dr. Bozzato, thank you very much for your very, very interesting and very useful commentary talk, your paper. It was, very easily, could follow it very easily, and it was most informative, and I'm sure it raises questions as well as answers questions. It clarifies China's situation in the Pacific very much for all of us. And to Honorable Wale, thank you very much for attending and agreeing to be a commentator on this, the first of the series, and we look forward to your participation in the next few months. We'd really welcome you if you participate and be part of the series. And Dr. Shailendra Singh, of course, thank you very much for your participation, for your commentary. Very much appreciated, bringing everything to the grassroots level. All of the aspects were very much in the minds of people who, I'm sure, who attended this conference or this seminar. Thank you very much to all the participants and the people who were listening and sending their comments. And we hope that you'll be able to attend our next seminar, which is called a Big Power Rivalry in the Pacific series, of course, and it's China and Indo-Pacific politics, in the Indian perspective on China and Indo-Pacific politics. And it'll be, the presenter would be Professor Shailendra Singh from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. And we'll have commentators, Honorable Biman Prasad, we all look forward to him, Dr. Pradeep Taneja from the Asian Studies, University of Melbourne, and Dr. Anas Iqtait. He's from the Australian National University. So there will be three commentators on this very useful topic. I'm sure it'll be advertised and the topic will be much more clear than I've got over here. Thank you very much, one and all, and we look forward to you seeing you again as we proceed through the series. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.